This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 96. Challenging the distortionary impacts of land value.
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, land values and the economy. Do we factor in the influence of land value enough in economics, given that it's not just the amount of land that counts, it's also the position of the land? And just how wrong would things go if it was left entirely to market forces? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Now, land is considered as part of capital when we look at the factors of production, Steve, but it's a limited resource, isn't it? We can't have any more land, and even though there's a lot of it, it's the distance that counts, the distance from markets or distance from the power grid, and in that sense, it is heavily constrained, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is the point which was the major contribution I think that Ricardo actually made. I certainly don't regard comparative advantage as a contribution. I see it as a step backwards. But in terms of valuing land, he had a very simple model that said that when you first settle or you first start producing food, you use the best available land. So he has a qualitative grade in the quality of the land for producing output. You said you use the highest quality land initially. And then as you expand production, you've got to use lower quality land, which therefore means the higher quality land has a higher value in terms of capacity to produce than the lower quality land. You can't charge rent. Of course, rent is charged, but his hypothetical model was you couldn't charge rent on the lower quality land, but you could charge rent on the higher quality land because there was a premium. It produced more output, and therefore that was the source of money going to the landlord. The owner of the land would gain the increase in value between the lower quality stuff now being used as population grows, and the higher quality stuff was the initial.
But surely you could charge rent on all of it. You could just charge a higher rent on the high yield.
This is one of the points that Schumpeter made in his critique of Ricardo, where he talked about the Ricardian vice of making simplifying assumptions that eliminated everything else, and therefore the only conclusion you could reach was the one that the assumptions led you to. But fundamentally, yes, he said that the source of rent is the differential quality of the land, and that now, when you look in the scale of why is land so expensive to rent, why houses so expensive to buy in the heart of London versus in the periphery, it's because you're closer to the market. And that is the value. And that's where and I must confess I have never read Henry George. So I know a lot of people will be annoyed by that. Some of you are quite pleased by it. I simply haven't had time to get around to reading Henry George. But that was, I think, the fundamental point that Henry George was making, which pretty much Ricardo's theory of rent, and saying that increase in the value that people get by being landlords who own land in the heart of London is not due to what they're adding, it's due to the location and the social improvements that are made around that area. Yeah, and they gain from it. Yeah,
yeah, and I guess they're always going to go up, aren't they? Because it's a constrained resource. We've got a growing population. I mean, it's no surprise that land values. Because land is going to increasingly be in demand, the value of land is going to continually increase, isn't it?
And that's where people argue for a land value tax, to say, well, that increase is occurring not because you are adding to the value of not because you've added to the value of the land, but because let's just say
you were just lucky enough to have been able to afford it in the first place. Yeah. And from there on in, it's only going to go up. So you're just benefiting from history, basically.
Yeah, and like the classic thing which is happening in the UK right now, in London right now, is that they're calling the Elizabeth line, aren't they?
Yeah.
The new line. Okay, that Elizabeth line, wherever those stations pop up, areas which used to be relatively remote from transport in the heart of London are now going to be much, much closer to transport in the heart of London. Their prices will rise, and the idea of a land value tax is to say, well, that's not because you did anything to the land, because the state built that facility, which has now increased the accessibility of your patch of land to the rest of the city, and therefore we should be able to tax that. And in fact, a lot of people argue you could in fact pay for a lot of the infrastructure by putting a tax on the properties nearby whose values rise because of the state or whatever, even a commercial enterprise building that line beneath you. That should be taken back to the people who actually add the value, which is not the landlord, it's the society adding the facilities around it, which the landlord benefits from.
Well, so that then gets into the position of the land, which we sort of said, yes, well, obviously the distance from everything else is important, and that includes the distance from facilities. So building something new is an example, particularly if you're building, if you've built something and then something else comes along, then should you pay for the increased value? Similarly, if you build somewhere and then someone builds an airport right next door to you, should you be compensated? And it starts to get complicated because you can look at that in every for almost everything. There will be something that changes, which will change the value of the land, and it's external to the landowner.
But it also becomes an issue of what about communities themselves? Because I support, I get people often. Let's go back, just backtrack slightly. A lot of people, George's philosophy ends up with people saying we should have a land tax and that should replace everything. And effectively what they're saying is...
Including, you say no income tax, just land tax, right.
And that to me is, first of all, making a mistake about the function of taxation. It's still, from the perspective of seeing taxation of financing the spending the government does, which is a gold bug model of what money is. Money is gold, and you tax and get some of the gold for the state, and the state can then spend the gold. When the state creates fiat money, it doesn't need that. It doesn't need to tax it to get the money to spend in the first place. It's taking out of money the massive amount that it's injecting in by being something of the order of 30 to 50% of GDP, as the state is now across the whole Western world, including the United States, when you include in all the various levels of the government. And if you had that much extra money being created every year, you'd have a blowout in the money supply, a blowout inflation, et cetera, et cetera. So tax recirculates it. That's its real functional role. So the focus upon land tax as a way of raising revenue for the state is wrong. But a focus on land tax as a way of clawing back an increase in value that individuals get from work done by the network of which they are part. But they are not the ones doing the work itself. That does make sense.
Can we just explore that a bit further? Because I sort of quite like the idea, and I want to see where it could go wrong. I sort of half understand your explanation, but let's dig a bit deep on it. Because the idea, if you're very rich, what do? You buy more land because you see that land values are going up. You want a bigger house. You see it's a secure place to put your money. That's obviously why Russian oligarchs are spending it in London. If you had if the only form of taxation was land tax, then you might get smaller properties, and probably reduce the value of land because people don't want so much of it. It becomes a less scarce resource, still limited but less scarce. What's wrong with that? If you get taxed, if it was an annual tax, for example, you just got taxed based on the value of your land. What could go wrong?
Then one of the things that does go wrong with that sort of thing is where you have people who haven't bought land for the sake of its rise in value, but they bought there to live as part of a community. And if we're talking about Russian oligarchs in the heart of London, I don't think they're there for the community. But if you talk about a bunch of people who are now age pensioners who once were industrial workers whose jobs have gone, they've gone into retirement age, they're living in a community. If you put a land tax upon it, they've got to generate an income out of a property which generates no income. And that effectively forces them to sell and move somewhere else. Right. And what you get is undermining the cultural and social elements of the society in which we live. And frankly, we've done far too much of that. Yep. So I had this ambivalence. I like the idea of using a land tax to reduce the profitability of speculating on land by the oligarchs of the world, and to make land more accessible to people. That you can't have, and this is what's actually happening with London, you simply can't have it. It's not sustainable. You can't have a city where the poor who do a lot of the manual work, whether that's cleaning rubbish out of streets, or they're being nurses or doctors, or doctors being manual workers, but policemen, that sort of thing, can't afford to live in the city and can't afford to commute here at the same time. You have a real form of breakdown coming out of that. Yeah. And this is what I'm, so would a land tax reduce that? Certainly when you've got a place like London where the properties which are going up in the heart of London, where the most expensive rents are charged and where the most expensive house prices apply, you're not breaking up a community. It's already been broken up by the process of land price appreciation.
So land's got many uses though, hasn't it? I mean, when you look at apartments, they're real money spinners. So it's a no-brainer. If you always sell land to the highest bidder, particularly in places like London, then people are going to build apartments on it, irrespective of alternate uses. And some of those alternate uses could be, quite good social uses. And if we look at Sydney, we look at Western Sydney, for example, where a lot of land has been chalked up and sold to developers, and there's very little in the way of infrastructure. You go to Western Sydney, there's not a lot in the way of parkland, for example, or even the transport infrastructure to support it.
Yeah.
So there's a case where, some of that land should have been used for social uses, but was basically all sold to developers because you made money doing that. So if you always sell land to the highest bidder, you're always going to have that problem, aren't you?
Yeah, and that's what we're marketising is something that, in some sense, should not be marketised. And partly that Singapore has got an element of this. I don't know Singapore as well as I should on this front, but a lot of land in Singapore is publicly owned and can't be alienated for private use.
Right.
And that doesn't mean it's state and socialist, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, calling Singapore socialist puts an interesting twist on the idea of socialism. But it's socially provided. You realise that land is not something which it is not a commodity, and this is one of the essential errors of neoclassical economics. It treats everything as a commodity. Now, commodity is, in my definition of a commodity is something which is produced using other commodities and is itself used to produce other commodities. Now, land, of course, is needed to produce other commodities, but you can't produce land.
Yeah.
And that's the flaw in the logic. So when you apply sort of supply and demand, which has got its own flaws anyway, but apply that to something which you can't produce using other commodities, you inherently distort what it's about. And in that sense, saying, well, okay, because land is not a commodity, therefore we should not treat it as being a commodity market. Maybe large swathes of it should be owned for public reasons, and things like parks and stuff like that should be created, which we all enjoy.
Well, in theory, it is, isn't it? In that we do in most countries, most developed countries anyway, sort of zone land. So we say, well, this is for residential use, this is for manufacturing, this is for commercial property. So that sort of limits, I guess, the value that can be placed on a particular part of land. But
then you get the people who say, well, the whole problem about the rising house prices is lack of supply, and lack of supply comes because all this land is regulated. Let's destroy the regulations.
Yeah.
And
well, of course, the uses change over time as well. There's going to be less need for heavy manufacturing land use, and perhaps if Amazon continues to have its way, there'll be less need for commercial land use in city centres as well. So I mean, the use is going to change. So yes, I mean, old shops probably should become apartment blocks.
Yeah, that sort of change is a necessary part of an evolving city as it grows in size. But you also, it's reducing everything to being commercial and being a commodity when some things are fundamentally not a commodity. And whether you do that in the George's extreme at one stage where you say we tax the increase in land value, and that I hope some Georges come and try to challenge me on this, because I don't know the nuances of Henry George's arguments in the same way that I know those of Ricardo and Smith and neoclassicals, if there are such things as nuances in neoclassical economics, and so on. So maybe George had some ideas in mind for this. But if you start imposing a tax on the increase in value of a property over time, when you have people living in an area which used to be, like a lazy suburban region, and suddenly, because of the expansion of population, it becomes commercialized. So their land value increases, because if they sold the house, then what would be built there would be a block of units or a commercial development rather than a sleepy standalone house. That then forces those communities to break up. And you do see social damage coming out of this. And ultimately, my perspective is that economics should be serving society, not vice versa.
Yeah, but you could put measures in place to protect that, couldn't it? Because it can create problems as well. If you've got a little old lady who's lived in the family home all her life and she doesn't want to move, and why should she? But that family home is now worth 10 times, 20 times, 100 times as much as it was in real terms when she bought it, because it's right next to a railway line, or it's whatever the pressures are that have pushed the value up. When she dies, the kids are going to sell that home, and they might all suddenly become multimillionaires, and so through inheritance, and that creates a problem in itself as well. So it's not necessarily a good thing. You wanted to stay in the house, but couldn't you just say, well, okay, there needs to be a process where she can stay in the house, but like mortgage release schemes, that sort of thing. So that
in fact, I was about to use a very sexist term to describe it, and I will. I'll call it a grandmothering factor, because since women live longer than men, it's more
statistically you're safe. Yeah,
we go for. So we need to have some grandmothering involved in that, so that if you are somebody who has lived in a place, like I'll use my own family. The house in which I was raised, not born but raised, my mother moved into in 1957. So we're now talking 60 years of continuous inhabitation of that house. When she does move out of it, then yes, my siblings and I will benefit from the increase in the land value. And at that point, you should be imposing the taxation, but not before. Whereas if you have people building a block of apartments because they know that the Queen Elizabeth line is coming through shortly, or buying and selling land at that stage, they are literally, they're gambling on the increase in value of land that's going to come through social activity that they were not part of, but they're trying to exploit. But having a tax that tries to capture that so the revenue doesn't accumulate in the hands of the wealthy who do it, but is distributed through society. That is a worthwhile objective of a land tax. Yeah,
which I'm liking more and more because, I just don't see it is a way of stopping people speculating on a resource that will only ever go up. And so the only people who are going to benefit from it are the people who can afford to get on the ladder in the first place.
Yeah.
So, what's what not to like there? What about, the other extreme? We go back to Soviet Russia. Didn't allow the ownership of land. Well, they didn't allow it for private gain, did they? I think you could buy a house in the old Soviet Russia, but the ownership of land was treated as part of the capital, which basically was which was government ownership. We don't want to go all that way, but is more government ownership of land? Is that part of the thing here that we need to be looking at? Because of course, governments, local councils are busy trying to sell as much land as they can, and central governments to try and create more dollars for their budget bottom line.
Well, this is also one of the hassles in China, of course, although the reason that you have a high GDP in China is because of the link between property development and state-owned, local government, state-owned enterprises set up to generate apparent revenue inside the Communist Party. So we've got distortions in the use of land everywhere, and getting to the stage where you have a sensible balance between land as a place in which people live. And let's go right back to indigenous communities. They have the whole idea of owning land in the first place is alien to a lot of indigenous communities, because to them the land owns them, not vice versa. So we have a real struggle to balance this, and whether talking in capitalist or a socialist society, because in that fundamental sense we're applying logic that comes out of a commodity producing system, whether that's the old Soviet one or what we have with market economies today. We're applying a commodity way of thinking to a non-commodity.
And I wonder as well whether, we place a short-term value on land as well. And we have sort of talked about how it changes because of things around it. But also, we might find that suddenly there's valuable minerals that are underneath our block of flats. And so that changes over time as well. But then if you build a big oil derrick in the centre of London, that's not going to go down too well. So I guess that's another reason why we try and constrain influence. But that raises a couple of points. Are we placing too short term of value on land? Should we be looking at its longer term potential?
Well, this is the point I wanted to get to, and actually, just recently, I've just actually rewatched in flight the classic James Cameron movie Avatar, because that actually sets up the whole situation of an indigenous community living in a natural environment above a resource that the capitalist invaders from planet Earth wish to take over. And to get the community out of the way so we can access this extremely valuable mineral. I'll leave aside the logical idea of a mineral worth $20 million a gram being transported through interstellar space, but the actual idea of we treat land as simply part of a production system, and it is not part of a production system. It's part of the ecology. Yeah. And this is the damage we're doing now in terms of thinking about this just entirely in terms of economics, which again is one of the limitations both of the anti-market extreme, which will be publicly owned, and the market extreme as well. It's part of the ecology, guys. And we have taken over so much for humanity's use that what's left of the planet to reproduce the ecology is becoming extremely fragile. And recently, one of the benefits of the internet, I know we're talking about the internet shortly, is some of the factoids one learns that one wouldn't find out otherwise necessarily. And one of those factoids I recently saw was that the mass of the mammals on the planet, 90% of the mass of the mammals on the planet is either humans or animals being bred by humans for their use, whether that's eating them or back in the old days riding them. But literally 90% of the mammal mass of the planet is derived from humanity's needs. Now that's leaving 10% for the planet to regenerate. And that isn't enough. And therefore we simply say part of the land of the planet has to be there for the planet's for the capacity of the ecology of the planet to reproduce and evolve over time. We've taken so much of that space that we're challenging we're challenging our own capacity to exist on this planet.
Yeah.
And that's, so the flaws in the thinking go beyond leaving out the role of land as a non-commodity. It's leaving out the role of land as the basis of the ecology. And without the ecology, there ain't no economy.
Well, and I guess, part of a lot of what we're talking about now is no surprise to most people. I'm sure, everyone is aware of the issues about how we get the balance right between the applying economic principles to the value of land and the role of government. And both of them are dangerous because, governments can get stuff wrong as well. It's finding that happy medium, isn't it? And I don't think anybody anywhere in the world has actually found an answer to that, have they?
Well, it's not just it's not a duality. It's a triumvirate, because the other issue is the need for the ecosystem to reproduce over time for us to have an economy in the first place.
Well, you sort of hope the government might have an interest in that, but obviously, we look at our world leaders. No, they don't see it as a concern, do they? That's true.
No, they're happy to bomb each other's land territories rather than trying to help them regenerate. So it is we in that sense, the land will have the final say because. We're talking land, we're talking the surface of the planet, we're talking the ecology of the planet. That is what enables us to exist in the very first place. And we have not even integrated that into our thinking. And we wouldn't even be having discussions about carbon pricing and carbon capture if we hadn't abused the system in the first place.
Yeah. So I know you're a man who's far too busy to play computer games. I don't either. But I have played years and years ago SimCity, which is actually quite an educational game in that where you build towns and you do have to allocate land, and you see how that land is sold, and you see the impact it has with pollution and the like. And what tends to happen, because you can play it with multiple players, is what tends to happen, and then you can start trading with neighboring towns and cities. And what tends to, with people who are just on the internet and you don't know who they are. But what tends to happen is you tend to specialize. So you build a town, you say, well, I'm going to build a heavy manufacturing town. It's going to be polluted to all hell. And over time it'll change, and I can start to move to biotech and other industries. But initially it's just making all its money from polluting the planet. And nobody wants to live there because it's polluted and nasty. So land, housing is very cheap there. And then someone in a neighboring town says, well, okay, we're going to build a really nice area because we're away from the wind blows in the right direction. So all the pollution goes away from us. We're going to build really nice housing because these people working here are probably earning decent money. And we're going to specialize as a sort of residential town, and that'll allow us to start building an education sector and stuff like that. So you start to get specialisms developing. And by market forces, by people playing the game. Doesn't tend to happen. Well, it sort of happens in reality. But is that, I'm just wondering whether, in fact, if there's a way that you devolve more responsibility to local authorities in more of this decision making, and also funding, and making sure they're getting the right funding. I know this is a bit of a monologue, but I'll come back to you so you can give your observation. I was talking to somebody a long time ago and saying the big problem with immigration in countries is that the local authorities who bear the cost of the immigration don't see the benefits of them. So therefore, financially, so therefore they're always against having more migrants into their town. Whereas if, for example, you had a higher level of land tax, for example, getting back to that one, that didn't go to central government, went to local authorities, then they might be more open to having more people because it would enable them to provide more facilities. So I'm just wondering whether, more localization is part of the answer.
I think partly more localization is, but the other issue is that you don't get rewarded for reserving part of the land for uses other than part of commerce. And like just one event I'm well aware of, because some friends of mine were actually working in the responsible government department. And this is when Ralph Correa was president of Ecuador. There was a discovery of a large oil deposit beneath a section of the Amazon that's in Ecuador that was unmined. And there was a very substantial deposit, and one of Correa's principles was to restore the ecology rather than damage it. So he actually said that we will not mine this this resource if we get paid to preserve this part of the forest by the rest of the planet, because we'd rather leave it pristine, but we need the revenue. And so we have this choice. Either we get revenue from other people for not exploiting the oil, or we exploit the oil. And he spent quite some time trying to find a means, in terms of people looking for carbon sequestration and carbon offsets and all these sorts of ideas. If that had actually worked, then he would have been able to effectively get carbon offsets for keeping the forest and not demolishing the forest, reducing the capacity of the planet to absorb the carbon dioxide, and then pulling more fossilized plants out of the ground and animals and fossilized animals as well, which is where oil apparently comes from, and burning it and adding more carbon to the atmosphere. He couldn't get it, so they finally gave us, we reluctantly are going to have to mine this oil. Now, so we don't. Which
I find surprising. I would have thought all the oil-producing nations in the world would say, yes, we'll pay good money to constrain the market, so we don't have a new player adding to supply.
That's a good point. That of course that would have been seen as a constraint of anti-competitive constraint.
Well, hello, OPEC. It's all about constraint of trade.
But we have an ideology that says we should have a more expansive trade. And that would be fine if the elephants and lions and tigers actually had money and could pay for maintaining their environment. But of course they don't. So what we get is an encroaching of the commercial system across the surface of the planet. And when it gets to 100%, we die. Now this is the dilemma we've got ourselves in by ignoring the ecological role of land. So even giving the Georges credit for talking about capturing part of the margin increase, even talking about the need to maintain communities. It's all had a human focus on it, as if we're the only ones on the planet and we could survive if we were the only ones on the planet. We aren't and we can't. And that's what we haven't yet to work out a proper role for land in that sense, that we're talking about the ecology.
Well, there's only
mining the ecology. And
there's only two options, isn't there? So, I mean, from that ecology argument, but also just, stopping also that the fact that land is increasing in value and it's going into the hands of fewer and fewer people. We're getting back to the days where we've got landowners and the rest of us are just serfs. We might as well, give ourselves to domestic service right now and live underneath their very large houses. I mean, because they're sort of almost the direction we're heading. So there's only two ways you can solve that. One is that the government makes a call on everything, and you sort of like say, well, right, we're going to own all the land from now on, and we're going to determine how it's used, which of course is not possible. Or it's through some form of taxation to solve the problem. It can only be those two alternatives, can't it?
Ultimately, it has to be a collective decision not to use part of the land. I mean,
that's never that's never going to happen.
Well, I think it will be forced upon us. I don't think it's going to happen voluntarily. By the impact of us damaging the ecology.
Right, which is going to be, so it's going to be governments forcing it on. I mean, it's going to be people voting for governments.
It won't be a market decision. We won't be paying money to maintain the Amazon, because the amount of Amazon we want to maintain won't necessarily relate to the amount the sloths need. And that's the way in which the market system ultimately breaks down, as a way of valuing the finite resource called the surface of the planet Earth. And that is what, ultimately that will force a government-style solution upon us, because to say we have to maintain a certain percentage for it to reproduce, to sustain and reproduce the ecology and let the planet continue evolving, despite our presence on it.
But that's not going to happen. I mean, there's
not until after it's absolutely too late. Not until after it's too late, yeah.
So, and yet, when we do talk about it, we talk about it at a very surface level. We talk about giving money for ecological causes. No one really as far as I can see, is really trying to tackle. What's the economic solution? How do we develop a system that's going to enable sustainability? Those two issues, sustainability, but also making land affordable to everybody, getting back to the more local housing issue.
And this is partly what I'm trying to do with developing my Minsky software over time, is get to the stage where we can do combined ecological and economic modelling, which was where the original limits to growth study came from, but make it much more sophisticated, because we have to say, okay, in terms of what scientists know about the proportion of the planet needed to enable ecologies to reproduce and to change and evolve over time, what proportion has to be reserved for non-human, non-market work? And we'd be talking, given the scale of our presence on the planet, we'd be talking a substantial part of it that has to be given back to nature, not to be used for commercial, not to be used for residential, and so on. And I honestly can't see us make that decision in any sensible way. It'll be after we should have done it, and we'll have encroached to 2 and 3 times the scale of the planet we should have used for commercial and human application by the time we do it.
So the Club of Rome, when they produced Limits to Growth, that was 1974, something like that, wasn't it? So
72.
72. Yeah. So here we are, sort of like 45 years or so later on, and making no headway.
Yeah, and of course the trouble is, the reason that these things tend to hit you in a rush is that you have it's an exponential growth process. Yeah. If you imagine a rate of growth of the order of 3% per annum in terms of the scale of the economy, pardon me, therefore the encroachment of the economy upon the ecology, that means that encroachment doubles roughly every 25 years. And you double and double and double and double. You're talking, 16 times the usage. We're up to about 8 times the usage that we had, pardon me, back when limits growth came out. And so you don't hit this constraint at a gradual tapering. You hit it like you're accelerating into a brick wall. And that's what I think we'll find we've done. And once you hit the brick wall, you've gone 2 or 3 times past the position you should have swerved at in the first place.
Yeah. Let me start on Mars. All right. Good to talk, Steve. We'll catch you again very soon.
We got to Mars in that conversation. I didn't even mention Elon Musk once.
I did it for you, absolutely.
I get accused of being an Elon Musk on the payroll. It obviously is recruited you as well.
It's just grubbing off on me. Yep. Look, next time we're going to talk about the internet. We'll catch you for that one.
Okay.
I just mentioned it because I was surprised he hadn't. That's it for this time. We will catch you again when we do discuss the role of the internet and the power of the internet. Are there monopolies that need to be broken up? That's next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. We'll see you then.